Hello, boys and girls. We're back. We're going to talk a little bit about skin cancer, a major disorder of the skin, and something we should all be concerned about. My PowerPoint will wake up here for me. There we go. All right. All right, so what is skin cancer? What happens with skin cancer? Any type of cancer in the body, what's happening is the cell cycle is happening over and over and over again. If you remember the cell cycle, we talked a little bit about that when we were going over the epidermis. So most cells in your body are not supposed to be dividing over and over and over again all the time. But when a cell becomes cancerous, it's doing that. It's just undergoing mitosis over and over and over and over and over again. So one cell becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16. And normal cells in your body don't do that. Only certain cells in an adult body divide and are replaced, like those cells in the stratum basale that we talked about. Cancerous cells are dividing out of control, and then also they acquire the ability to spread elsewhere in the body. That ability to spread, that's Ernie the dachshund barking in the background. Spread is called metastasis. So most types of cancers kill you when they overgrow within some major important organ and cause that function to stop working, like your liver or your brain. Or what happens is they undergo metastasis, and those cancer cells actually spread. They get into your lymphatic vessels, they get into the blood, they exit out of the blood into new tissues, and they start to overgrow in a vital organ, and then that screws up the function of that organ, and you wind up dying. All right, so a tumor is just a name for an overgrowth of cells. So you have cells that are dividing out of control. Now, if those cells aren't spreading elsewhere in the body, and if the growth is kept controlled in a contained area, they're said to be benign. That's a benign type tumor. They don't metastasize. They don't spread. All right, so anytime you have a mole on the body, that's actually a benign overgrowth of melanocytes. That's the reason it looks dark. So those melanocytes are making melanin, so they have a dark color to them. And so when you have a mole, you've got like a clump of melanocytes. A mole, another name for a mole is actually a nevus. That's one of the clinical terms for a mole. All right, now true skin cancers, what are your risk factors for that? Our risk factors are things, if you engage in those behaviors or these things happen to you, you're more likely to develop the problem. All right, so anytime you get overexposed to ultraviolet radiation, from the sun, that's one of the major risk factors, as we all know, for skin cancer. You can get exposed to so much ultraviolet light, the melanin just can't block it all out. And ultraviolet light, again, mutates DNA. It changes the AGCT letter code in the DNA, and those are your genetic recipes, as we've talked about before. If those get changed, cells can be killed by it. You can screw up your genetic recipes so badly the cells actually die. That's what happens when you have a sunburn and the skin peels off. Your skin cells actually died because the ultraviolet light obliterated the DNA, so their genetic recipes were no longer working anymore, and then the epidermis actually peels off with a severe sunburn. Frequent irritation of the skin, different types of irritation, maybe chemical irritation, is thought to be a risk factor for some types of skin cancer as well. All right, there are 3 major types of skin cancer. You may have heard of, I'm sure you've heard of the third one before, melanoma. That's the most dangerous type of skin cancer. The other types are basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and then melanoma. So these are actually named for So the name should sound familiar to you. For example, a basal cell carcinoma, what does that remind you of? Hopefully that's reminding you of the stratum basale. And indeed, when you have a cell down in the stratum basale of the epidermis and it starts dividing in an out of control manner and becomes cancerous and takes on the ability to spread, it's called a basal cell carcinoma. Now this type of cancer tends to be the least malignant. It's the most common. Least malignant means it's not as good at spreading elsewhere in the body as the other two types. Squamous cell carcinoma, all right, where do you have squamous cells? Remember those keratinocytes in the stratum spinosum? When they mutate and start to divide over and over again in an out of control manner and take on the ability to spread, then you have a squamous cell carcinoma. And then finally, melanoma. This is the most dangerous. Melanoma is developed from melanocytes. So you may have heard, of course you've probably heard before, that you should watch your moles, because moles are overgrowths of melanocytes, and sometimes some of the cells in a mole can become melanoma cells, so they become cancerous. They take on the ability to spread elsewhere in the body. They can spread to places like the lungs and the liver and the brain, and that is ultimately what can be fatal if that happens with that type of cancer. All right, here's an image of a patient who has a basal cell carcinoma on the nose. These types of cancers are, of course, as we talked about on the last video lecture, they become more common as you age. They're slow, so they develop in the stratum basale, and they very slowly invade down into the dermis and the hypodermis. And so generally, epidermis and the dermis, that's like the width of a piece of paper. So, it's very thin, so it's easy to cut these types of skin cancers off, in the doctor's office, and there's like a 99% cure rate with those. So it's much less likely that a basal cell carcinoma is going to spread from there into much more important parts of the body where that type of cancer could actually threaten your life. All right, squamous cell carcinoma, as I just mentioned, these develop when keratinocytes in the stratum spinosum begin to divide in an out of control manner. These are more dangerous than basal cell carcinomas. They can look like a patch on the skin that might get kind of dry and scaly. Typically found, you can see there on the scalp and the ears, lower lips, and the hands. And generally they'll treat these with radiation. Now that might sound kind of counterintuitive because we just said, well, ultraviolet light radiation from the sun is what triggered the cancer. And here, when you take radiation for cancer, they're blasting you with higher energy radiation, more dangerous types of radiation. And what those do is they're so strong, they'll actually kill the cancerous cells as well. Works in the same way that ultraviolet light does. It screws up the DNA. It mutates the DNA in those cells, and it actually causes the cancerous cells to die. Also causes your healthy tissues, can become damaged or die as well, which is why there can be so many side effects from those types of treatments. These types of cancers can also a lot of times be removed surgically. The really bad type of skin cancer, the one that we're warned about so much, and something we should all be paying attention to, melanoma. So now here's somebody with a really ugly looking melanoma that has developed on their thumb. I guess that's a thumb. Looks like is that a thumb or a big toe? It's kind of hard to tell in that picture. That's kind of a stumpy looking thumb, so I guess maybe that might be a big toe. But so when you have an overgrowth of these melanocytes, they make melanin. Melanins can have different colors to them. There are different types of melanins. So the melanoma itself may be multicolored. That's why they tell you to watch for moles that are changing colors on the surface of your skin. Big problem with these is they love to spread, they invade, they go down into the dermis, they go down into the hypodermis, and they get into your bloodstream, and they travel around to other parts of the body. So they're highly metastatic. They spread easily, And unfortunately, one of the worst things about melanoma is all these chemotherapy drugs we have for cancer. A lot of them don't work on melanoma very well. It's very, very, very difficult to treat. So they can cut them out by surgery. Then they do biopsies where they check the tissue to see whether the cells have actually spread into deeper tissues. Has it gotten into your lymphatic vessels, your lymph nodes? Because if so, that lets you know that it is spreading to other parts of the body. Immunotherapy, that's a new type of treatment for some types of cancers, where they are actually trying to force your immune system to attack these tumors and kill them for you, much like they would attack and try to kill bacteria or viruses, other things invading the body. You may have heard of this before, things to watch out with melanoma. There is an ABCDE rule. So, many of us have moles. I've got moles, and you just have to keep an eye out on them. It's a good idea to have your physician check them, or go to a dermatologist if you see anything fishy, so that they can check you out. The ABCDE rule includes: A stands for asymmetry. Something is symmetric if you can draw a line down the center of it and the two halves look the same. That's symmetry. So if you've got a mole that's asymmetric, that prefix A means without. So if you had a mole where like one half looked like that and the other half looked more normal, that lets you know something's going on over here. That's not looking normal anymore. That part of the mole is growing much faster than the other half. And so that can be a sign that a portion of that mole has turned into a melanoma. So you have to be careful with that. Border. Let me wipe this off here. A normal mole basically has a smooth border or an edge to it. Melanomas, like we saw in that picture on the big toe over there, the border can have indentations in it. You have an irregular border. Color, as I just mentioned, normal moles have kind of a brownish color to them, but if it starts to turn black, or you see red, multicolored, bluish colors in there, that's an indication sometimes of melanoma. D stands for diameter. If you have a mole that has become wider in diameter than 6 millimeters, that's like the end of a pencil eraser. If it gets bigger than that, that's an indication you might have a problem, and you should probably get it checked out. Elevation, E, from the skin surface. Now, healthy moles can elevate from the skin surface, but if you have a mole and all of a sudden it starts rising up off of the skin surface pretty quickly, that's, you probably need to go to the dermatologist and get that checked out. So now, just because you have one of those, or even a couple of those ABCDE rule violations by a mole on your body, that doesn't mean that you have melanoma, but it does mean that you should go to a dermatologist and get that checked out. All right, so that's skin cancer is a major disorder of the skin, and the last video lecture for Chapter 5, and also, for Chapter 5, we're going to talk about burns and some classification of burns, what goes on with a burn, and also how you can estimate the percentage of the body that has been covered by a burn. There's a method that is used to do that called the Rule of 9. So that will wrap up Chapter 5 for us after we go over that information.